The snow fell in thick, silvery curtains over the Loron duchy, blanketing the vast estate in a muffled silence that seemed to absorb every footstep and whisper. Winter had arrived with a ferocity unusual even for the Northern Highlands, transforming stone towers and cobblestone streets into a world of glistening white. From the high windows of the main keep, Duke Adrian Loron watched the storm with a familiar sense of controlled irritation. He had always considered himself a man shaped by necessity, not by sentiment, yet the relentless cold outside mirrored an equally persistent chill in his own life. The court demanded a marriage, alliances required attention, and the Duke's reputation was under scrutiny, though he had never shown concern over public opinion before. Now, that indifference had become a luxury he could no longer afford. Adrian, at 24, had the sort of handsomeness that made the notion of disinterest almost dangerous to those around him. Sharp features framed by chestnut hair, ice-colored eyes that missed nothing, and a posture that carried both nobility and discipline. He seemed to walk through life untouched, as if the world existed to accommodate him rather than the reverse. Yet behind the carefully measured exterior was a man weighed down by expectations. The ducal legacy, the unyielding council of advisors, and a life that had left little room for frivolity or affection. Though he had inherited wealth and influence, he had also inherited isolation. The Loron duchy, magnificent as it was, had been both cradle and cage. Meanwhile, across the town of Moraineville, Eveina Moreau was navigating a winter of a very different sort. At 23, she possessed a beauty of quiet distinction. Dark hair that fell in gentle waves, eyes that reflected both intellect and compassion, and a presence that suggested dignity even in the face of adversity. Her family, once proud landowners, had fallen into debt and ruin, leaving her to care for her ailing mother in a modest, frost-lined house at the town's edge. Yet Eveina moved through her life with a steady grace, attending to neighbors in need, managing her household with precision, and maintaining a poise that suggested she understood hardship without allowing it to define her. She had never sought attention, nor had she ever imagined herself at the center of a duke's calculating gaze. It was at the winter charity ball, held in a grand hall lit with countless candles and the soft glow of chandeliers, that their paths collided. The Loron duchy had always hosted the event, a gathering meant to display wealth, power, and, more pragmatically, to remind the nobility of the Duke's influence. Eveina had attended at the request of a family friend, reluctantly, but with the understanding that appearances mattered as much as survival. She moved through the hall with composed elegance, acknowledging the idle compliments of minor nobles and focusing on those who genuinely needed assistance. Her awareness of the room's subtle hierarchies, of whispered alliances and veiled ambitions, set her apart from the usual flutter of debutantes and socialites. Adrian noticed her immediately. There was no theatrical swooning or dramatic introduction. Eveina stood apart, quietly directing aid toward the less fortunate guests and speaking with a measured kindness that did not seek approval. Something in her calm, deliberate manner struck him as unusual, and he found himself observing where he usually would not. Her beauty alone was enough to attract attention, yet it was the combination of intelligence, dignity, and resilience that captured the Duke's interest. He had long thought of women as companions to convenience, tools for alliances, or distractions. Eveina challenged that framework simply by existing in a manner that refused to bend. By the end of the evening, after the ball had waned and guests had retreated to their private chambers or carriages, Adrian approached her with a directness that startled even himself. He did not offer polite conversation or idle pleasantries. Instead, he stated what he had decided in the span of an hour of observing her interactions. "I pick you as my wife for a few weeks." His voice carried neither hesitation nor charm, only the blunt certainty of a man who had resolved a problem in the most expedient way possible. "A temporary arrangement," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that left no room for misunderstanding. "It will serve both our purposes. You will be provided for, your mother's welfare secured, and I will maintain my obligations to the court. After a few weeks, it ends. Nothing more is required. Evelina's initial reaction was a sharp, silent disbelief. Her mind raced as she considered the implications, the assumptions, the audacity of a duke claiming to choose her for a matter so trivial as political expediency. Yet beneath the shock, she noted the offer's practical side: temporary security, care for her mother, protection from destitution. These were tangible benefits she could not ignore. And though the arrogance of the proposition stung, she realized she had the power to define its terms. Calmly, deliberately, she set conditions: mutual respect, no humiliation, preservation of her dignity, and a clear understanding that the agreement was limited to the time he specified. Adrian, accustomed to yielding little to the whims of others, found himself agreeing without argument. Perhaps it was the novelty of encountering someone who would not immediately submit to his authority. Perhaps it was simply the efficiency of compromise. Within a week, the arrangements were formalized. The wedding itself was brief, a ceremony conducted in the chapel of the Loron estate. Candles flickered against the stained glass, casting fragmented light across their faces. Neither spoke of love or passion. There was only formality, the legal and social acknowledgement of their temporary union. Evelina's composure remained intact, though a subtle tension lingered in her shoulders. Adrian's expression, usually unreadable, suggested a faint curiosity, an awareness that he had entered a new dynamic, one that demanded observation rather than control. After the vows were exchanged, the snow outside continued to fall unabated. The world seemed suspended in a delicate balance of white, the frozen landscape reflecting the emotional distance between them. They stood together, side by side, on the frozen lake near the estate, the surface glassy and unbroken, mirroring the unspoken boundaries that defined their new relationship. Adrian's gaze lingered on Evelina, not with tenderness, but with a growing sense of attention he had not anticipated. She met his eyes briefly, acknowledging the formality of their arrangement, yet giving nothing away. The wind swept around them, carrying the soft hiss of snowflakes and the distant cry of winter birds. It was beautiful, cold, and perfect in its reflection of their situation. Two people bound by necessity, yet surrounded by the vast, unknowable potential of what might lie beyond their current understanding. As night fell and the estate's lights glimmered through the snowstorm, both recognized, though neither admitted aloud, that the coming weeks would demand more than compliance. There was an unspoken tension, a quiet anticipation, a recognition that while their marriage was temporary, the effect of sharing space, duties, and silence could ripple far deeper than either of them had calculated. The snow continued to fall, thick and unrelenting, as if heralding the trials, discoveries, and subtle transformations that winter would bring. And in that frozen moment, beneath the cold brilliance of the northern sky, both the Duke and the young lady understood that the true challenge of this arrangement had only just begun. The Loron estate woke each morning under a heavy blanket of snow, the vast halls echoing with the quiet crunch of footsteps across marble floors. Winter had settled in with a steady persistence, and though the days were short and gray, Evelina moved through the estate with a purpose that gradually began to soften the rigid edges of the Duke's household. At first, she had kept to her chambers and the formalities expected of a temporary duchess, attending only the minimal duties required by law and custom. Yet the staff soon noticed her presence carried warmth, a subtle energy that transformed the cold grandeur of the estate into something less austere, less intimidating. She spoke to the servants with sincere curiosity about their families, helped the cooks plan hearty meals for winter nights, and asked about the village children who often passed through the gates. In these small ways, she created an intimacy that Adrian had neither expected nor particularly wanted to acknowledge. Adrian himself remained aloof, though less so than he would have been in past years. He watched Evelina from his study windows, where the snow swirled in chaotic patterns across the grounds, and noted the peculiar effect she had on the estate. She reopened the neglected west wing, long abandoned to drafts and shadow, arranging it as a makeshift classroom for orphans from nearby villages. The sight of her kneeling to adjust a blanket for a shivering child, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders, brought a strange, unfamiliar tension to his chest. He did not understand why the image lingered, why he found himself lingering by doorways and corridors, hoping for a glimpse of her movements. Adrian was unaccustomed to noticing such details, yet they seemed to etch themselves into his awareness, marking his days with a new kind of preoccupation. One afternoon, a blizzard struck the duchy with sudden ferocity, trapping them in the estate as the snow piled high against the doors and windows. The wind roared across the frozen lake, shaking the ancient timbers of the great hall, and the entire household was confined to the warmth of the castle. Eveina, unaffected by the storm's severity, insisted on bringing tea and warm blankets to the staff, moving with a quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. Adrian, observing from the shadows of the library, felt an unfamiliar impulse to intervene, to join her in the small acts of care that seemed effortless for her. When he finally spoke, it was not the calculated politeness of a nobleman, but something softer, more candid. You move through this house as if it belongs to you, yet you have claimed nothing. What? Eveina looked at him, surprise flickering across her features before being replaced with her usual composed smile. Because a house becomes more than walls and floors when people care for it, she replied, her tone calm but firm. Because cold is less frightening when shared, and warmth is more valuable when given freely. There was no insinuation of sentimentality, only clarity. Adrian, who had long associated warmth with weakness, found her words disarming, though he did not reveal it. He turned away, pretending interest in a ledger, but the rest of the day passed under the subtle weight of his growing awareness of her influence, a presence that infiltrated even the most routine moments. As the storm raged outside, they were forced together in the North Wing library, a room lined with volumes that smelled of dust and oak. Eveina wandered through the shelves, her fingers brushing spines, her eyes scanning titles with curiosity. Adrian sat near the fireplace, the flames reflecting in his ice-colored eyes, and observed her in silence, noting the meticulous care with which she organized scattered books and restored order. You have a way of seeing what is overlooked, he said at last, not as a compliment, but as an acknowledgement. Eveina glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. And you have a way of noticing what others fail to understand, she replied, careful not to provoke. There was an unspoken agreement in that exchange, a recognition that though they were bound by convenience, the boundaries were already shifting. The days that followed were marked by small but significant changes. Adrian found himself accompanying Eveina on his short walks through the estate grounds, ostensibly to ensure her safety from snowdrifts and ice patches, but the excursions became more than supervision. They shared moments of conversation by the frozen lake, where the ice glittered in the winter sunlight like fractured crystal. Eveina spoke of her childhood, of hopes and quiet dreams, without expectation, without sentimentality. Adrian, for the first time in years, listened not as a ruler assessing advantage, but as a man encountering another human being whose courage and grace were qualities he had never before considered. One evening, as twilight fell and the snow softened to powder, Eveina slipped on the ice near the edge of the frozen lake. Adrian's reflexes took over. He caught her arm before she fell, steadying her against his chest. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the formality that had defined their interactions dissolved. Eveina laughed softly. The sound carried across the still winter air, and Adrian felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through him, a sensation he had long convinced himself was unnecessary. He released her slowly, almost reluctantly, aware that the moment would linger far longer than either of them expected. The thaw of the ice seemed mirrored in the thaw of their mutual awareness. Adrian began to notice when Evelina's laughter carried through the corridors, when she paused to help a servant, when she lingered by the fire with a book rather than retreat to her chambers. Each observation was accompanied by a rising discomfort he could neither name nor resist. He was enused to longing, and yet it crept into his chest with a subtle insistence, demanding recognition even as his pride resisted acknowledgement. Eveina, for her part, sensed the subtle changes in him. The moments he lingered where before he would have passed by, the flashes of attention he could not entirely conceal. Their companionship, though still bounded by the original agreement, began to evolve into something more complex. There was a rhythm to their days: shared meals, quiet walks, exchanges of ideas and observations. Adrian found himself anticipating her presence, an awareness that unsettled his carefully ordered life. Eveina, equally perceptive, recognized the shift but remained guarded, aware of the time-limited nature of their arrangement and the risk of investing her heart too fully in a man who had made their union transactional. Yet even in her caution, she could not deny the subtle threads of connection that had begun to weave between them, threads that promised warmth in the midst of relentless winter. As the sun set on a particularly crisp afternoon, casting long shadows across the snow-laden grounds, Adrian found Eveina standing by the greenhouse, her hands brushing the dust from old plants and arranging seedlings with delicate precision. He watched for a long moment, noting the care and attention she devoted to even the smallest details. For the first time, he realized that the estate itself, his life, and perhaps even he himself were less empty with her presence. The wind whispered across the frozen grounds, carrying the scent of snow and pine, and he understood that the coming weeks would test more than endurance. They would test the boundaries of pride, desire, and the unspoken vulnerabilities that neither had yet admitted. In the quiet hush of the Loron estate, amidst the snow and flickering firelight, two lives began to intertwine beyond obligation. The winter stretched before them, unyielding in its cold, yet beneath its surface, warmth was gathering. And while neither dared to name it aloud, both felt the subtle pull of something stronger than convenience, something that threatened to redefine the terms of their temporary union entirely. The estate seemed smaller in the silence that followed the court's announcement. The temporary marriage had achieved its purpose. Political rivals had retreated, rumors of scandal had been quelled, and Adrian's obligations were secured. He had fulfilled the practical side of the arrangement, yet the emptiness left in its wake was undeniable. The halls no longer carried the soft laughter that had begun to echo between rooms. The warmth that Eveina brought to every corner seemed to linger only as a ghost of memory. Adrian had expected relief, a return to solitude and order, but instead he felt a hollow ache, a subtle but persistent disturbance that gnawed at the edges of his composure. He had succeeded in every practical sense, yet in the quiet moments before dawn, when snow still clung to the turrets and the world was hushed, he realized that the cost of victory was more than he had anticipated. Eveina, meanwhile, moved with careful intention as she prepared to leave. She packed her belongings with quiet deliberation, folding gowns and linens with precision, arranging her few personal effects in neat bundles. She walked through the room she had come to manage with a certain tenderness, straightening cushions, adjusting candlesticks, leaving behind only subtle traces of her presence. To the staff, she was calm, composed, and reassuring, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of melancholy she refused to acknowledge. She had kept her promise. The arrangement had been temporary, and she would depart on the dawn carriage, leaving the estate, the Duke, and her own unspoken attachments intact. Her heart, however, felt the weight of every small connection she had formed. The children's laughter in the West Wing, the whispered thanks of servants, the quiet mornings of shared tea with the Duke. Each memory pressed against her resolve, yet she reminded herself that duty and survival required her to leave without hesitation. Adrian, for his part, remained in the study late into the night, attempting to organize the ledgers and correspondence that now bore little meaning. He glanced toward the West Wing, where Eveina had spent countless hours attending to the orphan classroom, and found his thoughts lingering there despite himself. Pride, long his shield against emotional entanglement, now felt like a cage. He could no longer maintain the pretense of indifference. He realized, with a clarity that unsettled him, that the absence of her presence was not merely a matter of loneliness. It was a profound disruption to the rhythm of his life. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of candlelight seemed to echo her absence. Yet he did not act. Fear of vulnerability, of admitting to feelings that might expose him to weakness, kept him in place. He told himself that gratitude would suffice, that appreciation for her care and intelligence was enough to honor her contribution. He rehearsed formal statements of thanks, carefully measured to avoid any hint of emotional dependence. But the reality of seeing her prepare to leave, the knowledge that the carriage would arrive with the first light of dawn, unsettled him in a way no ledger, no political victory had ever managed. He could sense, in every corner of the estate, the faint imprint of her presence, a reminder that the world he had built was now incomplete. The morning arrived under a sky heavy with fresh snow, the ground glazed with ice that reflected pale light. Eveina stepped lightly into the carriage, her hands steady but her heart racing beneath her composure. She glanced back at the estate one last time, taking in the sight of the frozen lake where she and Adrian had walked, the greenhouse where seedlings had begun to bloom under her care, and the corridors that had slowly grown familiar under her measured steps. For a fleeting moment, she considered turning back, imagining Adrian calling after her, confessing the unspoken, but she shook the thought away. She had promised herself restraint, and she would honor it, even if it cost her in ways she could not yet measure. Adrian emerged from the shadowed doorway at that precise moment, drawn by instinct and the silent urgency that had been building over days and nights. He stood for a moment, watching her movements, the way she adjusted the cloak around her shoulders and lifted her gaze toward the snow-laden horizon. There was a quiet terror in realizing how quickly someone could disappear from a life one had taken for granted. And for the first time, Adrian understood that his feelings had extended far beyond obligation or casual interest. Yet still, he spoke with formality, suppressing the swell of desperation that threatened to break his restraint. "Lady Eveina," he said, voice controlled but carrying a subtle tremor, "the estate thanks you for your service." Her eyes met his, steady and measured, yet flickering with the emotion she would not articulate. "I kept my promise," she replied softly, her words precise, even as her chest tightened with unacknowledged loss. The carriage wheels shifted against the snow, and the moment stretched, fragile and tenuous, suspended between duty and desire. Adrian felt a hand tighten around the edge of the doorway, a physical manifestation of his inner tension, and realized that in every sense that mattered, he could not let her depart so quietly, so completely. But pride restrained him still. He had no words to confess, no phrasing to articulate the storm that raged behind the calm mask he wore. Instead, he turned back to the house, the sound of his boots crunching on the frozen ground the only witness to his inner tumult. The carriage began to move, wheels grinding against ice, and Evelina's figure receded into the gray morning, leaving only a scarf she had left on the porch railing, a pale reminder of the presence that had irrevocably altered his life. Adrian seized it, the fabric a tangible piece of warmth, and clutched it against his chest as if it might anchor the fragmenting pieces of his composure. The day stretched forward, each hour marked by a growing awareness of absence. Meals remained untouched, corridors echoed with emptiness, and the greenhouse, once vibrant under Evelina's care, seemed to sag under the weight of neglect. Adrian attempted to immerse himself in business, in correspondence, in the mechanics of power, yet every effort felt hollow. The estate's grand halls, normally suffused with authority and order, now felt cavernous, their grandeur magnified by the lack of laughter and presence he had once dismissed as inconsequential. It became impossible to deny. Her absence was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a fundamental disruption. By evening, the storm returned with renewed intensity, snow piling against windows and drifts forming along the carriage paths. Adrian paced the hallways, restless, aware of the deep void Evelina had left behind. The scarf in his hands carried her scent faintly, an echo of warmth and presence that made the house feel simultaneously inhabited and deserted. He finally admitted, though only to himself, that he did not want this arrangement to end, that he could not endure the world without her presence, without her voice, without the quiet authority she had brought to his life. The realization was terrifying in its clarity. He had been given weeks to choose convenience, and in that brief span, he had unknowingly chosen something far more profound. The night pressed against the Loron estate, snow piling high against the stone walls, as the Duke remained standing by the window. The world outside was a frozen expanse, yet inside, his heart churned with unrest, longing, and the sudden, undeniable recognition of love. The temporary arrangement had ended as it was meant to, yet its consequences were far from resolved. Adrian knew that if Eveina left, the emptiness would be permanent, and the pride that had long governed his actions would offer no solace against the ache that had begun to claim him entirely. In that moment, the Duke understood, with painful clarity, that what had begun as an exercise in expedience had become the most essential element of his life, and he had no idea how to reclaim it. The snow fell with a merciless intensity as Duke Adrian mounted his horse, the leather reins cold against his gloved hands. The Loron estate faded behind him, its dark silhouette swallowed by the swirling white. Yet in his mind, every corner remained vivid. The laughter in the west wing, the flicker of candlelight across Evelina's face, the warmth she had brought to halls that had long known only silence. Pride had kept him restrained, had held him back from confessing a truth too potent and frightening to name. Yet the hours of solitude and absence had stripped away the pretense. He did not merely want her to remain. He could not imagine existing without her. The carriage that carried Eveina through the snow-laden countryside was his target, and with every pounding hoofbeat, his resolve hardened. Eveina, seated inside the carriage, had kept her composure even as her thoughts betrayed her. She had imagined this journey countless times, leaving the estate with dignity intact, honoring her own promises, and never granting herself the indulgence of regret. Yet now, as the wind rattled against the windows and the trees bent under the weight of snow, doubt crept into her mind. She had felt his presence beside her each day, subtle and constant, and though she would not acknowledge it aloud, she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his attention. A part of her, a part she refused to name, had hoped he might act, might speak, might reveal that the man behind the formality was something different, something capable of feeling as deeply as she had begun to. The carriage jolted against a hidden drift, and in that instant, Adrian drew up alongside it, dismounting with a speed born of desperation. The snow whipped around him, stinging his face, yet he ignored the cold. His heart hammered with urgency, a pulse matched only by the frantic determination to confront what he had long concealed. Evelina's eyes widened as the shadow of a rider approached, then recognized him in disbelief. She opened the door just enough to speak, her voice measured despite the tension in her chest. "Duke Adrian, what?" "I cannot let you leave," he interrupted, his words sharp, carried over the storm. "Not like this. Not without knowing what has been impossible for me to say until now." His eyes, ice-colored but alight with raw emotion, met hers. "I told myself our arrangement was temporary, that you were a convenience. I was wrong. I cannot live without you. Not for weeks, not ever." Eveina regarded him with a mixture of caution and surprise, her composure holding even as the snow clung to her cloak and hair. She did not immediately speak, sensing the gravity of his confession, the vulnerability hidden beneath the veneer of authority he always maintained. In this moment, he was no longer the calculating duke who had chosen her for expedience. He was a man stripped bare, his pride shattered by the necessity of honesty. The storm around them seemed to recede in significance compared to the storm of emotion he laid before her. He stepped closer, kneeling in the snow despite the chill that numbed his boots, a gesture uncharacteristic and yet wholly sincere. "Eveina," he said, voice low but unwavering, "I feared loving you. I feared what it would mean to admit that I need someone as fiercely as I need air. But I cannot pretend any longer. I'm not offering security or convenience or obligation. I'm offering my heart, wholly and without reservation. Stay not for weeks, but for a lifetime, if you will have me." The wind carried his words across the snow-laden field, and Evelina felt the weight of them settle into her chest. She studied him closely, noting the rare vulnerability in his posture, the intensity in his eyes, and the tremor of honesty in his voice. For weeks, she had measured herself against the distance he maintained, the unspoken walls that governed their interactions, and the careful limitations she had set upon her own heart. Now, those walls wavered, and she sensed the possibility of something deeper, something enduring. Yet she remained cautious. Promises made under duress, even heartfelt ones, required affirmation. "I will not stay merely because you demand it," she replied, her voice calm, yet carrying the authority of someone who had endured hardship and loss. "If I am to remain, it must be with the knowledge that partnership will be equal, respect mutual, and honesty unbroken. I will not be a convenience, Adrian, nor will I be silenced by affection alone." A flicker of relief passed through him, mingled with a dawning hope. He extended his hand, palm open, not as a command, but as an invitation. "You shall have nothing less. I promise you that." The sincerity of the vow resonated beyond words, settling into the rhythm of the falling snow, marking the moment as more than a plea. It was a declaration of shared intent, a bridge across weeks of hesitation and silence. Evelina hesitated, then placed her gloved hand in his. The contact, brief but laden with significance, conveyed trust, acknowledgement, and the first step toward a shared future. She drew herself upright in the carriage, the storm around them still fierce, yet the space between them transformed. Where once there had been obligation and caution, now there was clarity, mutual recognition of the feelings that had grown despite time and circumstance. The carriage began to move once more, but it was no longer a vessel of departure. It was a vehicle of return, carrying them toward a future neither could have imagined at the outset of their temporary union. Adrian mounted beside her, his expression no longer guarded, the tension in his shoulders eased by the certainty of her presence. Evelina allowed a faint smile to touch her lips, the first unguarded gesture since their journey began. They rode in silence, the storm outside less significant than the quiet understanding that had blossomed between them. Each glance exchanged, each subtle touch, conveyed volumes unspoken, a language of trust and burgeoning love that required no embellishment. As the Loron estate appeared through the swirling snow, its stone towers and frost-lined gates no longer seemed imposing but welcoming. The halls that had felt hollow in her absence now promised warmth. The rooms that had echoed with emptiness now ready to embrace shared laughter and quiet companionship. The snow, relentless and pure, seemed to soften at their approach, the first hints of thaw reflecting the transformation of hearts within the estate. Adrian dismounted, offering Evelina his arm with a grace that spoke of newfound humility and devotion, and together they entered, leaving the storm behind, yet carrying its lessons within. Inside, the estate had changed subtly, as had they. Villagers and staff, sensing the return of the Duchess under different circumstances, greeted them with smiles and whispered approval. The frozen greenhouse had begun to revive under the attentiveness they both would provide, a living metaphor for the warmth now present in the household. Adrian and Evelina moved through corridors no longer as temporary companions, but as partners. The tension of weeks dissolved into the certainty of shared purpose. Their eyes met in the grand hall, and in that silent exchange, both understood the profound truth. What had begun as necessity had evolved into something enduring, something unbreakable, something chosen freely. In the glow of candlelight, amid the quiet hum of a house transformed by care and attention, Adrian spoke softly, his words carrying the weight of confession and triumph alike. "I chose you for weeks," he murmured, eyes fixed on hers, "but now I choose you for a lifetime." Evelina's hand found his, fingers entwining, and in that moment, the estate, the snow, and the frozen world outside seemed to acknowledge the resolution of their story. Winter had been unrelenting, cold, and exacting, yet it had yielded to warmth, to connection, to love that neither time nor circumstance could undo. They stood together, side by side, watching the last of the snow settle against the frozen lake, now softened and glistening in the faint light of approaching dawn. The future remained unwritten, yet the foundation had been laid. No longer bound by temporary arrangements, no longer constrained by pride or fear, they faced the world with hands joined, hearts aligned, and a certainty born not of obligation but of choice. The storm outside raged on, yet within the Loron estate, warmth reigned supreme, and the promise of shared life stretched before them as boundless as the horizon.